This is, again, a massive question. It's a question I've given an hour-long lecture on, and again, that's, I think, available on our website, certainly on bethinking.org. If this is a question that troubles you, there's also a chapter in my book, Why Trust the Bible, on this issue. I think it's a huge issue, partly because Richard Dawkins and other ones of the New Atheists invoke this God of the Old Testament motif as an ethnic cleanser, genocidal maniac, as a reason not to believe in the God of the Bible. And I think we need to be honest as Christians when we read those passages in the Old Testament. It is troubling to read about these wars and that kind of killing. So I want to give you 4 headings that I have found helpful in understanding this. The first heading is the heading of judgment. Now, Michael's talked a bit about judgment today, and we've talked about the Old and New Testament and how they fit together. The first one thing I want you to hold in your mind with regard to this is to think with the Old Testament and New Testament, there is both continuity, similarity, and discontinuity. There is a moment of change. A New Testament does come. A new time does come. And so the wars we're talking about are in the Old Testament, which has been brought to an end, a season that has been brought to an end. So the first heading, this idea of judgment. The way that Christians have understood these passages is to see that within that Old Testament, within that specific period of time, there were various means of judgment, and one of those means of judgment was war. Now, it wasn't always God's people, Israel, going around being victorious in wars as a means of God's judgment, meting out his judgment. In fact, when you read the Old Testament, more often, God's people, Israel, are on the receiving end of his judgment through war, lest we think this is an ethnic or kind of genocidal kind of issue. We see the same words, the same idea of the ban, the harem, which is the command to wipe out, used against God's own people as a means of judgment. Now, I wonder how you feel when I use that word judgment. Even in the evangelical church, the word is not used very often. We don't like it. We feel, gosh, it's a bit over the top to talk about judgment. My perspective on this changed when I moved to a community in London called Peckham. I lived there for 7 years with my husband, and we were running a church there called All Saints. And a number of things happened that I think changed my perspective on judgment. One of them was that there was a woman who was the same age as me. I was 27 when we moved there. She was 27. I didn't have children yet. She had 5 kids. She'd had different partners, some of whom had been abusive. Anyway, she became a Christian. We became really good friends, and I really enjoyed her children. Her oldest daughter was 13 at the time. So one day, this friend, we're doing Bible study together, and I'm going to meet her to do Bible study in her flat. She's got 5 kids, 3 dogs, really small flat, just full of the love of Jesus. She's come to know the Lord. And when I see her at the door, she is unrecognizable. Her ex-partner, who was was the father of one of her younger children, was a crack addict. He'd gone to prison. He'd come out of prison. She had a restraining order against him. It hadn't worked. He'd come round to her flat. He had beaten her so much. Her face was huge. Her head was like virtually double the size. She nearly lost her eye. He'd violated her 13-year-old daughter in front of her, destroyed her, or tried to kill her. Okay. So she went to hospital. Her eye was saved. A few days later, I'm there to do Bible study. Now, when I see her, I see my friend who's raising her 5 children on a council estate in Britain, really doing an amazing job, and this guy has come and done this. What does love say? Does love say, oh, it doesn't matter. Don't bother ringing the police. He should get away with it. Does love say that? No. Love cries out for justice for her. Because I loved her, I wanted that guy to be caught and put back in prison. You see, love cries out for justice, for judgment. And in the Old Testament, as well as in the New Testament, we see a God who is full of love for people. He's full of love for the victims of horrible things like that one tiny thing I've told you, which in the big scheme of what people have experienced in this room is one awful thing, and in this city. God's love means that there must be judgment when things like that happen. Now, within the Old Testament, God is both loving, and because he's loving, he's also a judge. And within the time frame of the Old Testament, a season that has come to an end, war was one of the means of his judgment. So the society, the Canaanite society, which promoted child sacrifice and child abuse on a massive scale, actually as part of the religion, came under the judgment of God. And when you read the text, what you see very much is that it's the religion that is being judged and the violation of the weak, the violation of particularly women and children. So that's the first heading, the heading of judgment. The second heading I would give you is the word accommodation. It's a theological word. It doesn't mean your hotel or your house that you're staying in. It's the idea that God accommodates himself to our level in order to reveal himself to us. What that means is that because he loves us, even though he's infinite, he's God, he's the Trinity, he's the creator of the entire cosmos, the universe, he actually involves himself in human life. And that means that he has to accommodate himself to our level. So he uses means, human means even, to bring about grace and judgment. So he uses a wooden cross in order to bring about forgiveness. But he also uses human means like war. Now, for some of us, that's difficult to get our heads around. Remember, it's within a time frame in the Old Testament. The third heading is the idea of time, which we've touched on, that this happens within a limited time frame. Often people think the Old Testament is full of genocide, constantly people are going around killing other people. And actually the wars that are particularly troubling, where we have this idea of the ban and judgment and all of that, occur within a very short time period, generally under the time of Joshua, and there's one a bit later in the time of Samuel. And then the fourth heading, which I'll just touch on, which really does need, if you're troubled by this, I really strongly urge you to research more, is this whole area of language and context that we need to understand. I have 3 children, they're all boys. I have twins who are 7 and another little boy who's 4. My children love sports and they love winning. They really, really love winning. And that's a bit of a problem because they play tennis and they often play each other. Now, one day, my little boy, Zach, came home to me, and the tennis team that he is in, they are unbeaten in the region, and, they're in the newspaper. He's thrilled. It says, unbeaten, Zachary Orr-Ewing. He wants it framed. He loves this newspaper clipping. So he comes home and he tells me, Mum, we played X, Y, and Z teams, and we slaughtered them. We obliterated them. There was blood on the floor. Okay, now he's a 7-year-old boy who loves to win. Now, was there literally blood on the floor? The other one said, yeah, we were over the moon. Does that mean they jumped over the moon? Okay. When we look at language, and particularly when we look at some of this language in the Old Testament, this idea of the harem, the ban, there is military rhetoric being used. So when it says everyone that breathed was wiped out, a few verses later, Joshua says, God says to him, when you settle in the land, don't let your children marry their children in case they take you to worship their gods. And you end up back in this situation of idolatry and child sacrifice. So clearly, everyone that breathed of that nation was not obliterated, and neither did God think they were going to be obliterated, since he has this command not to intermarry. So we need to be really careful in how we understand it. And that doesn't mean Joshua's lying. It doesn't mean that there's a deception. It means that when people read that ancient text who understood the language, they knew that there was a metaphor going on. This is a form of rhetoric that was being used, just like when I say to you, Elijah was over the moon that he won. You know that I don't think he pole vaulted literally over the moon back to earth. Do you see what I mean? So we need to understand language. And then finally, context. What was Jericho like? Archaeologists tell us Jericho was a fort town. It was small. The Israelites could go round it 7 times in one day. It was very small. Maybe only 100 people possibly lived there. It was a garrison town where the army were based, and probably some religious leaders were there. And those who were civilians there were in the service industry. Think back to the story of Jericho. Who do we know of in the Bible who was in the service industry? She's called Rahab. She ran the bar, possibly a brothel. She's known, it's implied that she was a prostitute. So the people who were working as civilians in that town are actually named in the Old Testament account. And guess what? They're delivered. Rahab puts the red cord, and anyone who will listen to her warning is able to come into her house and be saved when the war comes. So it's not as simple as it seems at first look. Think about those. I think I've actually given you 5 headings, but think about Vince is nodding. Think about the 5 headings. Judgment, time, accommodation, context, language. And when we see that, what we see is not a God who's filled with hatred, not a God who is a genocidal maniac or is in any way commending genocide. We just see that he accommodates himself and uses the human means of war in a particular time period as one of the means of his judgment.